So good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome and thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Daryl, and I'm the Mental Health and Wellness Manager at the Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council, or the IPHCC for short. For those who may be unfamiliar with the work that we do, the IPHCC, we're an Indigenous governed, culture-based, and Indigenous-informed organization. Our main objective is to support the advancement and evolution of Indigenous primary healthcare services throughout Ontario. We work closely with 22 Indigenous healthcare organizations across the province, focusing on addressing the physical, spiritual, emotional, and mental well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and communities. The IPHCC is pleased to introduce you to our guest speaker today, James Vukelich Kaagegaabaw. James is a descendant of Turtle Mountain, an international speaker and the author of The 7 Generations and the 7 Grandfather Teachings, as well as the creator of the Ojibwe Word of the Day. James is deeply passionate about inspiring individuals to live fulfilling lives by sharing ancient wisdom and offering modern solutions through an Indigenous perspective. He's recognized as a leading voice on the interconnectedness of language and culture, with his insights stemming from conversations and recordings with elders and native language speakers in what is now Canada, Michigan, and Minnesota as part of the Ojibwe Language Dictionary Project. During this session, we'll explore the significance of language and culture in the context of primary healthcare environments. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to James. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, James.
Miigwech, aho, buju indinoy magnatok, anin, Kaagegaabaw indishinikas, Mikanak and Dudem, Mikanak waju wing and Dunjaba, Beshoga Kaba Kong and Up Pajigo Miigwech, Bizindawieg, and Gajaganashin Gaye. So I will speak some English as well. What I said there was hello, all of my relatives. My name is Kaagegaabaw. I'm also James Vukelich. I'm Turtle Clan. I'm a descendant of Turtle Mountain. I live close to Minneapolis, Kakabakong, the place of the falls, a city in Minnesota. And I am incredibly grateful to have an opportunity to do a lunch and learn with all of you. You're all working with healthcare. My brother is a medical doctor. Dr. Vukelich is a psychiatrist who has worked with both Native populations and with the general population. And as well as our veterans here in the United States. And so as his wife, and I'm incredibly grateful for this moment to talk to you all, and a little bit humbled by that as well. I know the important work you're all doing. And so what I thought I would share with you today is a cultural perspective that may help you see the world through a different lens and may actually develop some familiarity with some of the populations, with some of the people that you're working with. And I think for me, this has been something that I have been striving for the past 11 years to speak about all over the world, not just locally, nationally, but internationally as well, and to have an opportunity to speak about this concept of 7 generations. And this is a concept that shows up internationally in Indigenous country. For example, the Lakota warrior in Holy Man, He Hakasapa, Black Elk, he spoke of a time after that terrible battle here in the United States at Wounded Knee, that it would take his people a period of 7 generations to make the hoop of life whole again. One I heard in high school came from Daganawida, the great peacemaker. And when he brought the great laws of peace to the Haudenosaunee speaking people, he told them that in every one of your decisions and each one of your deliberations, you are going to have to think 7 generations into the future. Now, when I heard that as a teenager, I found that very profound, yet a little confounding. How do we do that? How do we come up with an action, a choice, a decision that is going to affect someone I'll never see, I'll never speak to, I'll never listen to or hold? How do I come up with a decision that will affect someone 7 generations from now? And for the first part of our talk today, what I would love to do is present an Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Nakaway, Saulteaux perspective of that. Each one of those names is referring to this same group of people. Or our autonym that we use here in Minnesota, it's Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, and I'll use those terms interchangeably in the talk today. And I think it's really important in an audience like this, many of you are probably aware of this, but to point out that when I stress this is an Ojibwe perspective, not everyone is aware of the fact that Haudenosaunee, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and Ojibwe are as different from each other, comparatively speaking, as German, Somali, and Mandarin Chinese. 3 different nations speaking 3 different languages on 3 different continents. And although we share some common cultural, physiological, spiritual similarities, each nation has been given its own gift, its own language, its own worldview to contribute to the world. And so I always like to acknowledge that we're speaking about an Ojibwe perspective here. So here we'll start with this first generation. This is Neen, I, me, myself. A note on what we're looking at, this was once a petroglyph. It comes from the word petrostone and glyph, something that's written down. And it may have been moved to a wigwasabak, a birch bark scroll, and today we're using Zoom with PowerPoint to discuss this. So the media has changed, but the message is still the same. Here's our first generation, Neen, I, me, myself. Our next generation is Noos, my father, Ninga, my mother. Now these are the older terms for my father, Noos, and Ninga. More contemporary speakers may use Ndede or Nipapa, but I like to use and share these older forms of address, these terms of relationship. I think they connect us to our history and how far back our history goes. And we'll find out in our next generation how long that is. Nimishomas is my grandfather. Nokomis is my grandmother. And when I say that some of these words are old, I think we could make a case that this sound noko dates back to prior to the ending of the last ice age. That means most likely where you are at in Canada, where I am at here in Minnesota, when there was a mountain of ice a mile high before the Gitchigami, the great sea of the Anishinaabe, Lake Superior existed. There were people who saw woolly mammoths, giant moose. Here's some examples of those at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. They saw Missamik, a giant beaver. And when we say giant, they were about the size of Mahua. And if you can imagine the size of bears back then, they were about 11 to 12 feet tall on their hind feet. There was someone who saw all of these beings who referred to his or her grandparent using that sound, his or her grandmother using that sound, noko. We don't know what the ending was. It may have been nokometha, nokomasa, nokomala, but we know that that noko was there. So some of the languages that you will hear spoken in Canada and here in the United States date back for thousands upon thousands of years. And I always like to give people that perspective when they're working with speakers of Indigenous languages, that our history did not begin with contact. Contact is kind of a drop in the bucket when we consider the totality of the story that's been told here in Mikanako-Minising, here on Turtle Island. And so we started with I, me, myself, Nin, Noos, my father, Ninga, my mother, Nimishomis, my grandfather, Nokomis, my grandmother. And then we have my great-grandparent, Indonako Bichigan. That could be my great-grandfather or my great-grandmother, but it really doesn't just mean that. It has in it Anik. And this is as scientific as we will get with this talk today. Anik, it's a morpheme. It's the smallest part of a word that carries meaning. And there's a period in my life where I became absolutely fascinated by what this word part means. Again, maybe I'll introduce myself a little more in depth. Kaagegaabaw, Indigenous. My name is Kaagegaabaw. I'm also James Vukelich. I didn't hear the Ojibwe language until I was a 25-year-old man. I was originally going to be a French teacher. I had begun in film and video, studied English, and discovered French literature along the way. And I decided the best and most expedient way to learn the language would be to do total immersion. So I moved to Quebec. I went to the Université de Quebec at Trois-Rivières. I did French immersion for a year. And when I came back to the United States, I had every intention of becoming a French teacher. When I went back to school to take my degree, I did take one more course to get my full financial aid packages to qualify for loans and grants. And I saw Ojibwe was being offered. And I thought, well, I should try this. My mother is Ojibwe. My grandmother is Ojibwe. At this point in my life, I had studied French, Italian, even some Latin. And I thought, well, I'll give this a try. And I remember walking into that class with the book by Maud Keg, Portage Lake, Noah Kamakukwebun. The late Maud Keg wrote that. Seeing this word, Ishwa Manomankewat, after they were finished making wild rice. And when I read it on the page, it took up half of the page. And I was absolutely fascinated. I was like, who uses a word this long? What does this word mean? And I had begun the most exciting philosophical, spiritual, linguistic journey of my life. And despite having moved to another country to learn another language, I went all in Ojibwe and began studying it whenever I could, with whomever I could. Ended up studying at a number of different places with a number of different speakers, and having the opportunity to meet elders, fluent first language speakers, hereditary chiefs, traditional healers, as well as with the world's leading linguistic expert in the language. And that's when I began understanding how important these small word parts were in understanding the language and culture. Anikinutage. Each one of these words, you'll note that anik, that morpheme shows up in here. Anikinutage, it's to translate. And I've had an opportunity to already do this in this talk. It's to say a word or a phrase in one language and then repeat that in the target language of your audience. Anike Ogamakwe is a vice president, a vice chief, a vice superintendent. It's someone who fulfills the role of the leader if the current leader can no longer do so. The kwe suffix at the end of Ogamakwe denotes a woman. This could be a reference to Vice President Harris or Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, who is the first Indigenous woman in Minnesota to hold that position. Anekegama, there are a number of these where I grew up in north central Minnesota. Chains of lakes, bodies of water that are connected to each other. And then Anakobadu. I don't know if we have any quilters, people who make their regalia, who work with beads. When you run out of thread and you tie another piece of thread to it, you've interconnected those two pieces of thread. You've interlinked them. So when I asked a fluent first language speaker what that word meant to him, he thought pensively about it. He knew I had a Western education, a Western background, and answered very philosophically. It's a lot like a bike chain. From his perspective, these could be the 4 generations of my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, and myself. So if we were to translate that word in Donakobichigan, it could mean a number of things. It could mean my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother. It can mean my ancestor, that person I was speaking about earlier, who saw the mountain of ice, giant beavers who referred to his or her grandparent as Nokum. I can refer to him or her as an ancestor, as in Donakobichigan. But if I were to spiritually and culturally interpret that word, I think it means that being I am inextricably interconnected to, that being I am inextricably linked to. It's also our word for my great-grandchild. We use that term interchangeably with one another. When I first learned that, I asked myself, I wonder if they're actually saying I am you, if we have the same name for one another. So if we look at a petroglyph like this holistically, if it works going up, it should work going down. Here we have Neen, that's I, me, myself, my children, and Gosis, my son, and Donis, my daughter. Nujis is my grandchild, and it's if I'm speaking to them, Nujisheak, my grandchildren. And then, of course, we have Indanakobichigan, my great-grandchild, and they refer to me as Indanakobichigan, my great-grandparent. So you'll realize that if you use that relative term, it immediately implies 7 generations. 7 generations that are punctuated intergenerationally by this concept of I am inextricably linked to you. I'm inextricably interconnected to you. Whatever is going to affect you will affect me, and whatever affects me will affect you. When I was a language teacher, I was asked so often, how do you translate that concept of 7 generations into Ojibwe? And it's almost too clumsy of a question. It handles that entire philosophical and spiritual concept with one relative term, Indanakobichigan. So when I realized this idea of sequence, this idea of interconnection, it brought up a number of teachings that take place both spiritually and scientifically all over the world. One was this, karma. And often this is mistaken as the law of cause and effect. When you look at what that word really means, and it has Kri in it. It's your actions, it's your deeds, your karma, or your choices. And you can develop good karma. You can act with kindness, altruistically, with benevolence, and that is what will return to you. You can also maybe developed bad karma. You've acted greedily, you've acted self-centeredly, maybe you've even acted with malevolence or brutality, and that is what we'll return to. This is a concept that shows up in a number of Eastern Asian religions. In Middle Eastern religions, particularly in the New Testament, this will become, you will reap what you sow. Whatever seed you plant in the ground, that is what you should expect to grow. Perhaps Jesus is more explicit about this when he states that if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. So it'll show up as a law of physics. For every action, there'll be an equal reaction. And the first time I saw double helix after learning that word in Danakopichigan, I saw links in a chain. And I asked myself, well, what am I passing down to my great-grandchildren? What did I inherit from my great-grandparents? It was my DNA, the very building blocks of my being. And I asked myself, well, what was my great-grandfather's experience like? He was born literally 100 years before me, before I was born, and he saw a great deal of change in his life in 1875, and he would see the creation of the reservation. I know there's a little difference in nomenclature. I know it's a reserve in Canada, but this was a place that he couldn't leave without express written consent from the Indian agent at the time. If he did, he'd be deemed hostile. He would be, I think a new term for that would be an enemy combatant. The army could engage him, even potentially kill him. He couldn't hunt or fish without, again, express written consent. Before we began this talk, I took a moment and I smudged. I used the Wingush and I introduced myself in the language. Here in the United States, that was an arrestable offense until 1978. People forget that in the land of prides itself on religious freedom, spiritual expression. And he would see one other great change in his life. His family structure would change. If you are asking yourself why I hadn't heard the language until I was a 25-year-old man, there's a very good reason for that. My mother went to a boarding school here in the United States. My grandmother went to a residential school, Canada. And these were total institutions. These were places where the clothing you wear, the food you eat, the language you speak, how you pray, the books you read, when you line up, when you go to the bathroom, when you go outside, when you sleep, all of these things are decided for you by the institution. And everyone watching this program today knows of two perfect examples of total institutions. One would be the military, the other prison. And in these institutions, my mother, my uncles, my grandmother, my grandfather had no exposure at all to the language, the culture, to the history, to the spirituality. And I think that's important to note that many people who had gone through that experience and removed from their homes at maybe 4 and 5 and 6, I've spoken to people of each one of those ages, people who ended up teaching me the Ojibwe language. That is when they left to go to boarding school. And so many of them, as it's coming to light through truth and reconciliation, and which I think Canada is way ahead of us here in the United States, that there were so many people who went through abuse, and that abuse could be mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, or sexual. And we may be feeling the after effects of that in our communities. In my case, I can smudge and speak the language whenever I choose. I can move anywhere I like here in the United States. I have the joy and the honor of raising my son at home. Yet we'll still see in our community, and not just here in the United States, but all over in Turtle Island, people who are dealing with the opioid epidemic, with methamphetamine, with maybe unsafe sexual practices, maybe gambling, chronic overspending, or even internet addiction. Asking ourselves, well, we didn't go through that terrible experience. Why are we dealing with it? And this may have been passed down intergenerationally. I know when I began asking elders how I could learn the language more efficiently, more rapidly, more holistically, they would tell me that the language was already in me. They used a different term for it. They used the word blood memory. And I didn't understand that right away. I didn't discount it either. I found that so many of the things our culture has told us, Western science is catching up with them. It's going to catch up with those teachings. And so we may have people in our communities who are dealing with someone's pain that is not their own. Later, when I would hear this term in a different context, in a different setting, intergenerational trauma, I began to understand that. And even when they were speaking about blood memory, to see some of the research that's taking place on epigenetics, on the idea that people may have inherited someone else's pain. Someone may deal with stress, with sorrow, or even with joy differently because of their parents, their grandparents, or even great-grandparents' experience. It changed the way I viewed the world. The people who had taught me the language went through this experience, and my parents, my mother, my grandparents, my uncles went through this experience as well, and it gave me an insight onto why they may act the way they do. However, I think it's important to note right now that we didn't just inherit trauma. The fact that despite after another pandemic, despite that systematic effort to destroy the language, the culture, the history, the spirituality, we've endured, and we're able to speak to one another and share these words that are literally thousands of years old. Shows me that we inherited strength, resilience, fortitude, strength of heart. And these are the things I would like to pass down to the generations who are coming. So this idea, it became so clear, and I was so excited when I understood this, that this idea of 7 generations. And I recall speaking to an old man who was telling me that in his day and age, in the Lake of the Woods area, there were elders who were trying to avoid using that term "neen," I, me, myself, the end of their lives. And when you translate that into Latin, it becomes ego. Everyone listening to this knows someone who is egotistical, egocentric, egomaniacal, someone who is thinking of themselves exclusively. How can I become more accomplished, more wealthy, more beautiful, more cultured, more educated, more powerful than you? I am looking out for everyone. I think those elders' examples were to say that this idea of ego to them was really a myth. For them, they were saying, I can't say all of my relative. I can't say I, me, myself. I am all of my relatives. All of my relatives are me. I am inextricably interconnected to them. And every one of my actions is going to affect all of my relatives. And everything my relatives do is going to affect me. I'm not isolated from them. I am them. And I have to tell you, the moment that clicked, it clicked because it was in the language. It clicked because it was in the language. It was authentic. It was genuine. And I was excited. It finally made sense because I had heard these things in ceremony in English, 7 generations. We're all related. We're all interconnected. And now it made perfect sense. And with that, there was like this awe-inspiring feeling that was raising within me, deep within me. For me, this was the birth of responsibility now that I knew. Now that I had spiritual and scientific proof that every single one of my actions, and not just me, if you are watching this afternoon, every single thing we are doing, every action, every choice, every decision is going to affect someone we'll never see, we'll never speak to, listen to, or hold. Every single thing we are doing is going to affect someone 7 generations from now. And I think my approach to that was no longer, why? Why am I alive? Why am I born? Why am I here? It's because I'm related. We always knew we would be here in 2023. It became how? How do I live in a way that brings peace and balance to all of my relatives? How do I live without conflict with my relatives or my ecosystem, my environment? How can I lead a holistic life? Life without contradiction, where I'm saying one thing and then doing another. Life where my actions are in alignment with my words. Our ancestors sought out this. So did people all over the world. And they'd come up with what's called minobu matsuen, a good life of peace, a life of balance. This is really a verb. This is something you do. It's a way you act. It's how you relate. And to live well, actually, and this is incredibly important because we think of just leading a good life, but there's also the natural consequence of having good health. Leading a good life brings good health with it. So this was the goal for thousands and thousands of years. It wasn't a professional goal. It was, how can I lead a life that brings me good health? A life that's positively beneficial for all of my relatives. And to do this, because it's the language, and I think it's important to share this with people. We shared some history, but It takes a long time for the one word to become the same word in a number of different languages. This is indeed a pre-contact concept. This is not a reaction to different spiritual and religious traditions that came here to North America. The first time Buddha spoke of the Four Noble Truths, when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, when Socrates was arguing and debating in the marketplaces of Athens, our people were speaking about leading a good life, living well, living with good health. And they shared a way to do this. They passed this down through the generations, the Gichi Dabakkonegewana. There was an elder, the late Richard Morrison, who taught me the Gagigeyanakkonegewana. And when you look at this word, when I've had a chance to speak to some communities with a number of fluent first language speakers, they'll giggle because when they hear Dabakkonege, Dabakkonegewanini, Dabakkonege with way, that's a judge. That dib part, it's to measure. Akon is with a wood-like article in your hand. So what they were speaking about was a sentence, a ruling, and with the gavel. However, if we look at a pre-contact meaning of what this word means, how do we lead a good life? How do we seek out health? How does the language tell us how to do that? We see that wood-like article, it's the okich, it's the pipe stem. Integral part to the Opagan, the sacred pipe. Implement a relative that we were given to ask for help, to pray, to give thanks, to make relationships with different nations. And it implies that what we're talking about is something that's been meditated upon and mediated with the Opagan, with the four medicines, with the asema, the tobacco, the wingush, the sweetgrass, the bushkode jibik or mushkode wash, the sage, or the gijik, and the gijik, the cedar. This is something that's been held in the highest regard. We also call these the seven grandfather teachings. And I understand we won't be able to do all of them today, but we'll do a brief etymology of a few and then a few with a deep, insightful look. So here's our first one, Deboywan, truth. I think this is important to note. This is originally a verb. Whenever we see win at the end of each one of these teachings, it turns it a verb into a noun. It nominalizes a verb, but really, ancestors' perspective is this is something that you do. It's a way of acting. It's a way of relating. Like minobamatsi. It's to live a good life, not a good life. It's something that you have to do. For me, when I heard Dave Boy, one etymology that was shared with me was he or she speaks from the heart. There's that word part, date, in it, heart, and way is to speak. I'm speaking to you from the very center, from the very core of my being. I am not adding to the truth. I'm not omitting things from the truth. I'm speaking as completely as I can to you. I'm relating my truth to you. And you'll note that in some birch bark scrolls and in some petroglyphs in Ojibwe country, you'll see a figure carved into stone or written on birch bark, and you'll see a center point of the heart and a line coming through it. This is something from the very center of us. So to seek out a life with truth definitely gives us good health, definitely shows us how to lead a life with all of our relatives. There's Dabasing Dezoing, humility. I really understood this through the context of fasting. He or she seeks out a vision. I read an account that was written in 1904, completely in Ojibwe, by the late chief John Benesi, Gagi Benesiban, at Fort William First Nation. And he was already an old man, so this must have taken place in the 1830s or 1840s. He was fasting. It's something that's incredibly good for us. It's very healthy. And as a young boy, he was woken up by his father one morning. He lived in a lodge. And he used that old term for my father, noose. Noose woke me up. And he noted Noose had two dishes, son, his father. One had meejum in it food, huyas venison, minan berries, manoman wild rice. And the other one had a kakanje. So the boy knows he's being presented a choice. An incredibly important spiritual teaching there. No one can make you have an experience like this. You have to choose to do it on your own. No one can have this experience for you. You have to experience it yourself. So he chooses the kakanje. The old man picks up the charred piece of wood and marks his face with it several times, makideke, to blacken the face. And for the next 4 days and 3 nights, he went without food. He went without water, in isolation. Maybe for the first time in his life, he was completely alone. And I don't know if you've ever had to fast for either medical or spiritual reasons, but I think everything past day 1 without water becomes very uncomfortable. And so as the sun is setting and it's beginning to get cold, as he's overlooking Lake Superior, he must be asking himself, how would I get food right now? How would I get water, clothing? How would I make a lodge or even get fire? And he's learning something incredibly important right here. What happens to a human being without food, water, clothing, or shelter? You will die. You will certainly die. For the rest of his life, if he meets someone without those basic core human needs being met, he'll feel a real and genuine and authentic empathy for them. I too have faced cold, hunger, thirst, and loneliness. And if I can, I will help you alleviate those. When you hear stories of our ancestors helping those people who came here to and would ultimately end up colonizing, settling North America, and did not know how to survive here, why they helped them, it was because it was embedded in their culture. It was embedded in their spirituality. And they realized then, where do I get my food, my clothing, my shelter, my medicine from? It all comes from the earth. That word, descendent, literally means I think lowly of myself. I am not more important than the animals, than the medicines, the mushkaki, the strength of the earth. When Anishinaabe needs healing, when Anishinaabe needs nourishment, they seek out mushkaki. That word literally means mushk, strength, and aki, the earth. And they're saying, I think lowly of myself. That dabas is low, and is to think, and dizo is of oneself. I am not more important than all of my relatives. I am all of my relatives. And in fact, I cannot survive without all of my relatives. In etymology, I heard in Ontario for that word Anishinaabe, human being, in the Nigagoon Seminakaning First Nation Reserve. For them, it was Anisha, the one, nothing, and Abe, the one who is nothing, the being who is nothing without the creator, without his or her relatives. And the Onigaming area of Lake of the Woods, it's to be humble before the creator, of humility. Kind of humility brings with it respect. To go easy on. The moment you realize that the animals, that the plants, that the trees, when you are harvesting them, they're giving you life in exchange for theirs. You take only what you need. You go easy on. For me, it's to acknowledge and to acknowledge the sanctity, the sacredness of your relatives' lives. It's to respect them. It's to go easy on them. I think it's a very beautiful way of describing respect rather than like a submission to authority, an acknowledgement of relationship. And why? Because we have love for one another. Now, I don't think that this is a definition of love. I think it's a description. It has in it the zog, which is to emerge. Sagachwe. This is a friend of mine's name. And what I love about this video is this is exactly what Chief Kaagegaabaw, what that young boy would have seen at the end of his first night fasting. And all of a sudden, Sagachwe. Now, the person coming from behind the mountain isn't a figure, it's Gimishomasanan, it's our grandfather. What we are seeing here is, what does unconditional love look like? When the sun rises on the morning, who does the sun shine on? Everyone and everything. We're seeing a description of what unconditional love looks like rather than a definition. Here in Minnesota, Zagibaga. The Zagibagagis, it's the budding moon. It's May. And you'll note that this is Mundaman, the wonder seed, corn. Corn is actually, it's being sold at our roadside stands now, but when it began in the spring, as the days became warmer and longer, the thunderbirds flew overhead. There were rainstorms and thunderstorms. Deep within this seed, life emerges. This medicine, and this food, which is medicine, which is the strength of the earth that heals us and nourishes us. When this corn comes to fruition, this corn will feed a thief or a teacher. It's showing us what unconditional love can look like, how medicine can heal. And the Zungide Ewan, the strength of heart, courage, bravery. And I know that's really what that word means. It has in it Zoom, which is strong, in the day is the heart. To have strength of heart, to show that kind of unconditional love to all of your relatives, to show that unconditional desire and urge to heal them, to look after them, to care for them, to have compassion and bless them unconditionally, which is really what our word Shawena means. But to be able to do that in your field, there will be times when you will need a strong heart to do that. And when you are looking after or people, you will note that your heart will become stronger from that. It will change the very center, the core of your being. So in Ojibwe, we'll have Debwe, which is to speak the truth, to speak from your heart. And there is also Gwakwatisi. Now, the first time I heard this, I didn't quite get it, because it's like, if you're honest, you tell the truth. You tell the truth, you're honest. And this isn't about what you say, it's about how you live. Gwakwatisi is to live properly, to live correctly, to live in order. I use this as an example of, are my words in order? Are they in alignment with my actions, with my choices? Am I walking the walk, or am I talking the talk? And everyone watching this will have someone in your life at one point or another who tells you to act a certain way, speak a certain way, dress a certain way, attend a certain kind of ceremony, and you watch them do something completely different on a Friday or a Saturday night. That would be contradiction or hypocrisy. And the Ojibwe language, if I am telling the truth, observe how I lead my life, and the truth will invariably come out. And if you are able to lead a life with truth, with honesty, with humility, with respect, with strength of heart, with courage, bravery, with love, then all of your decisions, all of your choices will be naturally intelligent. They will be naturally wise. They will be positively beneficial for someone who is coming 7 generations from now. You will not need to be able to see them to know that you will have acted in a way that brings peace and balance to them. We find ourselves in this place where we know we can't change anyone. We can't make anyone change. It's impossible, it's futile, it's a fool's errand. Yet we can acknowledge that we are all of our relatives, and all of our relatives are ourselves. So if we make the choice, if we make the decision, and it's an important decision, each time we are working with someone, each time we are in the community, each time we are in school, each time we're at the hospital, every single one of our choices isn't just affecting us and someone coming 7 generations from now. It's going to affect the people we're working with now. So we know that if we change ourselves, if we radically change ourselves, then we can in fact change the entire world. We change all of our relatives. And not just in the future. We're acting in a way that's positively beneficial for all of our relatives. Yet if we are inextricably interconnected to our great-grandparents, to those who are no longer here, then we are still living their story. Then we still may have a chance to heal those who are no longer with us. And when I'm asked, well, how do I do that? Seek out a life with truth, with humility, with Debwewen, Dabasendizowen. Do not exalt yourself above all of your relatives. To acknowledge the sacredness and the sanctity of your relatives' lives, to treat them with respect, to go easy on them, to have that unconditional and compassionate love, a love that blesses all of your relatives, have the strength of heart to look after them, have the strength of heart to make those decisions. Make sure you're leading a holistic life, a life where your actions are in alignment with your thoughts and words, a holy life. You'll truly act in a wise way, with wisdom. You'll truly lead a life worth living, and opamatsi, to live well, have good health, to have a good life. A life that's not just positively beneficial for you, but for all of your relatives. On that note, I want to take a moment and say, Miigwech Bizendawi, thank you all so much for listening to this. And in closing, so like I hope I've had an opportunity to share with you the importance of the language in observing the world and how they relate to the world. When I first started learning the language, and this was something that is incredibly rare in Indigenous country and Anishinaabe Aking, they all agreed on this. They were like, if you really want to know the culture, the history, the spirituality, the ethics, the philosophy, it's all in the language. It's all in the language. And it will literally take me until like that second year, I really started to understand what these elders were saying with these little word parts. And it is this beautiful 13,000 year investment in us, people who have lived before us, who have gone through these questions, who have asked, well, what is it to have a strong heart? What is it to truly love, or to be humble, to respect our relatives? We too went through this. How we pass it down, we will embed it in the language that people use. We know anything that we create will one day turn to dust. But human beings, we're hardwired to speak. We speak for the same reason. We can touch, we can smell, we can hear, we can see. It's hardwired in our minds to use language. What I don't think they could have seen was a period when Anishinaabe didn't use Anishinaabe. I don't think anyone could have predicted something like the residential school era or the boarding school era. So I hope I have left that impression that with only a handful of words that we've discussed today, how much knowledge was in the language and how that language can influence how we seek out a life. I think once people hear how to lead a good life in their language that's genuine, that's authentic, they're more likely than not willing to strive for that rather than seek out something else, seek out a life that doesn't bring peace and balance to them. And I think when we're working with people to have that moment to share with them, this is how people have done it for so long. I think it brings healing.